Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. After 12 years of truck driving, everything changed in August 2018. My favorite route was Interstate 40 through Texas. Cargoes that have been chilled from California to Oklahoma and occasionally to Arkansas. The long hauls paid better, and to be honest, I enjoy the quiet. However, my wife Carolyn insisted that I find local job and be nearer to home with her and our boys. Those interminable highway stretches, with only you, the CB radio, and whatever podcast you've downloaded for the nighttime journeys, have a certain tranquility about them. I was really good at my routines. Where could I get good coffee at 3 in the morning, and which truck stops offered the cleanest showers? Whose dispatchers would, in fact, take calls on the weekends. Out there on the asphalt, life made sense. Everything was arranged according to delivery windows and mile markers. The beginning of that Thursday was just like any other. In Bakersfield, I picked up a ton of frozen veggies. By Saturday AM, they had to be delivered to Oklahoma City. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as I pulled into the weigh station outside Amarillo, the temperature gauge on my dash read 104. I just contacted Carolyn to confirm the timing, so I can recall it exactly. Check in. I told her that, if I didn't feel too exhausted, I would probably make it to Oklahoma that evening. Though not crowded, the weigh station was busy. There were perhaps 8 or 9 rigs waiting to be inspected. This man in a white pickup truck with government license plates drew up next to my cab and banged on the passenger door while I was waiting my turn. Clean-shaven, in his mid-40s, with a credential that seemed official pinned to his chest pocket, wearing a yellow safety vest over a blue polo shirt. He motioned for me to roll down my window while holding up a clipboard. Voice all business, he said, referring to the Federal Safety Compliance Inspection. Last month, a new regulation entered into force. We must check every taxi for appropriate emergency positioning of the apparatus. It should just take 5 minutes. Over the years, I had undergone hundreds of inspections, but they were usually conducted by uniformed agents rather than men in pickup trucks. He still had the clipboard and the badge, though. Even displayed a formal-looking letter on letterhead from the Department of Transportation. Claimed that in order to expedite the inspection process, contractors were being used. Brought up a number of incidents involving fire extinguishers that were not securely fastened. He rattled off the numbers for regulations. He sounded as though he was well versed on the subject. The way he tapped his pen against the clipboard and continued to check his watch. He exuded the air of a government administrator only trying to make it through the day. I allowed him to climb into the cab after unlocking the passenger door. Big error, but it's always so obvious in retrospect, isn't it? He began marking items off his form right away. First aid kit, emergency triangles, and the location of the fire extinguisher, as if to check for dust or something. He had a strange habit of tracing the edges of everything he examined with his fingers. Then, with a holographic seal that glowed in the light, he produced a roll of tiny silver stickers that were perhaps an inch square, he said, peeled one off and pressed it firmly against the inside of my passenger window, right in the bottom corner where it wouldn't obstruct the view, explaining that it was past inspection. The sticker contained a code or serial number in small text that I was unable to read from the driver's seat. He made sure it was fully attached by pressing on it for 10 solid seconds. Then, like he was hanging a picture frame, he took a step back to inspect his job. He kept asking me questions as he was doing all of this. At first, it seemed like small chat to ask how many hours I'd been driving, when I'd last taken a break, and whether I ever had neck problems from the cab's continual vibration, the type of questions you'd expect from someone who works with truckers all day. Then he offered a question that seemed strange to me. Did I typically acquire a motel room or sleep in my taxi? He agreed and wrote another note on his clipboard when I explained that I slept in the cab most of the time to save money. It's smart, he added, but you ought to think about improving your sleeping arrangement. Recently, many truckers have been robbed at rest sites. He extracted what appeared to be a thin rope or string, perhaps 3 feet long, with loops fastened at both ends, from his vest pocket. He showed how to wrap it over the door handle from the inside and remarked, "This is a new security device we're recommending. Keeps the lock from being jimmied while you're asleep." As part of some safety effort they were undertaking, he handed me the cord and asked that I keep it. With an almost waxy coating, the material had an odd feel, not quite cable, nor quite rope. After observing how I handled it, he asked if I wanted him to demonstrate the correct fastening method for optimal efficiency. I felt really uneasy with the way he spoke and the way his eyes remained on my neck the entire time. I told him, "Thanks, I'll figure it out myself." And then, for a little moment, his entire manner changed. His breathing became shallow, his jaw tightened, and he clutched his clipboard until his knuckles turned white. However, he recovered just as fast, smiled at me like he had prepared, and replied, "Suit yourself," before getting out of the taxi again. Observed him making his way back to his pickup. I saw that before he drove off, he sat there looking at my truck for around 5 minutes. Without any problems, I arrived in Oklahoma City, dropped my cargo, and picked up another that was going west. However, that strange experience stayed with me. A Flying J outside Weatherford was my next destination. Another motorist I had known for years, Tom Inagwan, was there when I ran into him. I brought up the safety inspector's description of the entire odd encounter as we were getting coffee. Tommy's expression turned white. 3 days prior, he had experienced the same thing, same strange rope contraption, same yellow vest, same white pickup. In fact, he had allowed the man to teach him how to secure it, explaining that it could also be used as an emergency tourniquet in case of emergency. The man had tied it around the cabin door handle before abruptly yanking it tight. Tommy claimed it felt like a predator assessing him based on the way the man had gazed at him while yanking the cable taut. We contrasted notes and discovered that those silver stickers had been given to us both. Tommy still had his, and we could just make out small figures that appeared to be GPS coordinates when we glanced at it under the fluorescent lights of the truck stop. I had trouble sleeping that night. I continued to consider the rope that the man had handed me, which was still on my dashboard after I had thrown it away. Around 2 a.m, I was using my phone to browse trucker boards when I came across a thread that made me sit up straight. "Has anyone else seen a white pickup carrying a safety inspector?" Posted by Carl Brennan, a driver, 2 weeks ago. Though dispersed, the answers were all the same. This man had been seen by at least 6 drivers traveling across Texas and New Mexico on I-40. Here's what really got me, though. Since that first post, Carl Brennan had not updated his content. I looked up his login and saw that he was a frequent contributor, posting on routes and traffic conditions nearly every day, but then nothing appeared. After the inspector was mentioned, there was total radio silence. I discovered 2 guys who used to be active forum users were among the other drivers in that topic who had stopped responding about the same time. I called other drivers I knew and conducted research for the remainder of the night in an attempt to piece together what was going on. Around 4 a.m, I arrived at Bradley Forster, a veteran driver with 30 years of experience. Brad informed me something that brought about a complete transformation. Over the course of the previous month, His nephew's state police dispatch team had discovered 3 truckers dead in their cabs along the same section of I-40. They had lately discovered a link between the deaths, which had previously been determined to be medical occurrences, such as heart attacks or strokes. More significantly, each person had been strangled with what seemed to be the same kind of homemade ligature, and each had similar silver inspection stickers on their windows. The police were actively investigating, but they were staying quiet to prevent panic. According to Brad's nephew, the murderer marked his victims with those stickers and most likely used the GPS coordinates contained in the sticker codes to locate them at rest breaks. He did not give out the cable for security. He wanted his victims to keep it close because it was the murder weapon. I was pulling into a Weatherford State Police station by dawn. My passenger seat had that cord in a plastic bag. After seeing the sticker on my window, the detective I spoke with, Vasquez, who had coffee stains on her sleeve and weary eyes, phoned for help right away. An hour later, a forensics team was using specialized tools to scrape it off, taking pictures from every angle and recording the GPS coordinates. It was contained. I was shown pictures of the other victims by Detective Vasquez. They were all middle-aged men who worked as long-distance drivers and were discovered in their locked taxis with those cords around their necks. While they were sleeping, the murderer had been getting into their taxis and timing his attacks precisely by learning about their habits from the inspection questions. He was aware of which drivers slept in their taxis, when they would be by themselves, and when they would be most at risk. I was absolutely taken aback by the final picture she displayed. 4 days earlier, the forum driver Carl Brennan discovered me in a rest area that I had frequented numerous times. Hours were spent at the station reviewing every aspect of my interaction with the fictitious inspector. I assisted them in making a composite drawing. His brown hair parted sharply to the left, his rectangular face, the tiny scar that ran through his right eyebrow, and the way he held his shoulders abnormally straight, as if he were always at pay attention. According to Detective Vasquez, I was fortunate. He usually came back to assault within 72 hours of the first contact, according to the pattern they had discovered. I was unaware that I had been targeted for death. They posted alerts on all trucker forums and CB channels, sent advisories to every truck stop along I-40, and issued an APB for the white pickup. After months of studying dot processes, the investigation found that he had produced those official-looking stickers with embedded monitoring equipment and somehow obtained real letterhead and forms. He had transformed the very mechanisms designed to keep drivers safe into instruments for their pursuit. I'm still haunted by that detail. He had maintained journals in which he rated the degree of compliance of each possible victim. How simple it was to let him into their taxis, how remote they appeared, and how well known their routes were. 2 days later, they found him sitting in his pickup and observing a truck that he had marked the previous day as a rest area close to Albuquerque. He was Robert Hutchkins, a former dock worker who had been let go 3 years prior for improper behavior. He had been particularly preoccupied with the susceptibility of sleeping drivers and had filed several security-related reports that sounded more like murderous plots. 14 more of those wires, a package of those monitoring stickers, and thorough notes on dozens of drivers including their routes, sleep schedules, and personal details he had collected during his fictitious inspections were discovered in his truck. Before they stopped him, he had already slain 7 men. After that, I stopped driving long distances. I took a job doing local delivery, which brings me home every night. I still occasionally pass by truckers who are dozing off at rest breaks and ponder how many of them would let someone in with a safety vest and a clipboard inside. Even after they took it off, that tiny silver sticker still left an imprint on my glass. When the light strikes just right, I can make out a faint square outline. I retain it as a reminder that Carolyn wants me to replace the window. The 18-wheeler has been my home for the past 11 years. transporting everything from electronics to produce across the nation, proving that not everyone who says they are keeping you safe is. Things started to go awry on our routine travel from Denver to Chicago in late September of 2016. For 3 years in a row, we had been traveling that road twice a month, knew every diner, every pothole on I-80, every truck stop. Although Diane would take over when I wanted to rest, I did the most of the driving and she took care of the paperwork and navigation. We made a respectable living, had a solid system in place and, to be honest, enjoyed the freedom of the road. The CB radio was blaring with the usual banter, weather reports, speed trap alerts, and that gruff voice we had been hearing for months when we headed out of Denver that Thursday morning with a cargo of sporting goods. Nighthawk was the name of the driver. Nighthawk had a very slow, deliberate speech pattern, as if he was picking his words deliberately. When viewed in your nighttime mirrors, his black Peterbilt's unique chrome exhaust stacks resembled fangs. Diane always felt uneasy about him, even though we had greeted each other countless of times at different stops. According to her, he had a habit of continuously licking his lips, much like a reptile testing the air, and his eyes never seemed to blink sufficiently. In any case, truckers are a peculiar group, and you learn to be understanding. However, the CB was awash with anxious chatter about a third missing person along our path on Thursday. 2 days prior, Jeremy, a college student, had disappeared from a rest area close to North Platte over the preceding month. The other two had vanished. Last seen at the truck stations we frequented, both young males were traveling alone. We refueled and had lunch at a pilot station close to Sterling at around noon. There were a lot of truckers there discussing the disappearances. Additionally, I saw Nighthawk's boat parked at the distant end of the entire lot. Bill, an older driver, was showing everyone pictures on his phone inside the diner. They were screenshots of security footage that the police had made public. Despite their graininess, the pictures showed each missing person conversing with someone who was just out of the camera's field of vision in various locations. Everyone fell silent when Bill brought up a point. The edge of a black vehicle with recognizable chrome stacks in the backdrop was just barely visible in each picture. We all had the same thought, but no one wanted to express it out. Diane's claws dug deep enough to leave wounds as she grasped my arm beneath the table. We made the decision to go on without making any breaks until we reached Chicago. However, at about 8 o'clock that night, our engine began to make a grinding sound that I had never heard before. I had to pull over at a small, mostly deserted, truck stop close to Kearney, since the temperature gauge was rapidly rising. Only 2 of the overhead lights were on, so the cracked asphalt was covered with long, warped shadows. At first, we were the only rig there, so Diane remained in the cab with the doors locked, while I opened the hood to check the coolant levels. We heard it at that point. Behind us came the characteristic rumble of Nighthawk's Peterbilt. He parked, roughly 50 feet away. His headlights were still on, and aimed straight at us, while his motor was idle. I could just make out his figure in the driver's seat, still and observing through the glare. I struggled to keep my hands on the radiator cap while trying to concentrate on the engine. It didn't make sense that the coolant was bone dry, as usual. I had checked it that morning. Then I became aware of something that caused my chest to constrict. The drain plug has new scratches surrounding it, as if someone had just used pliers to release it. I was struck with the realization. It wasn't a mechanical malfunction. Our truck had been sabotaged while we were in the diner. Nighthawk's door was now open when I looked back to his vehicle, but I was unable to spot him. We were in a pocket of darkness between his headlights and the far-off brightness of the station's convenience shop when the overhead light closest to us abruptly flickered and went out entirely. Almost a whisper, Diane's voice crackled across our small radio. He's strolling about his caravan. From the back, something is leaking. The fragrance hit me before I could react. Something else blended with the new blood's distinctive copper tang, something chemical, such as ammonia or bleach. The wind had changed, and it came right to me from Nighthawk's trailer. Taking a flashlight out of our toolbox, I pointed it toward his rig. Its beam piercing the night. My legs went weak when I noticed the dark liquid trickling steadily from the back corner of the trailer and pooling on the tarmac in a growing smear that appeared black in the bright LED light. Nighthawk came out from behind his trailer and wiped his hands on a cloth that appeared to be soaked in the same black liquid. He had given up attempting to hide. Perhaps 30 feet distant, he stood in the open. He seemed to be observing us as his head tipped at an odd angle. He moved his lips, but no sound emerged. He seemed to be practicing words he wished to pronounce with this repeating gesture. I heard Diane providing our location over the radio, so I assumed she contacted 911. Despite everything, her voice remained calm. I began keeping the flashlight focused on Nighthawk. We backed toward our taxi as he started to approach us with these slow, methodical steps. At last he spoke, his voice as plain as day resonating across the lot. "You people need assistance. Being broken down out here at night is really risky. These highways are full of nasty people." How he, as the blood continued to stream behind him, he repeated it in a flat, emotionless tone that made every hair on my neck stand on end. When I got to our truck, I virtually threw myself inside by yanking the door open. Diane already had the engine running and our tire iron in her lap. It seems that only enough coolant remained to hobble in another location. Now, however, Nighthawk was right in front of our truck, his hands pressed to the hood. He had that same robotic smile on his face. We heard them as he began to walk around to my driver's side door. There were muffled noises emanating from within his trailer, like someone hammering on metal. The noises grew louder and more urgent. Then we heard a young, frightened voice, yelling words that I was unable to fully understand. Nighthawk's phony smile vanished in a moment, giving way to a stern and angry look. Pulling something from his jacket, he ran back toward his trailer. It appeared to be a little knife or even a syringe. Diane screamed for me to drive and seized a gear shift. Simply drive anywhere other than here. As we raced out of that lot, I floored it after slamming it into gear and grazing the edge of a concrete barrier. Behind us, I could see a Nighthawk, standing in the center of the road in the mirrors. He was getting smaller and smaller till the darkness engulfed him, but he was not chasing. As we flew down that deserted roadway, the speedometer reached 90. Steam began to emerge from beneath the hood as the engine screamed in protest. We traveled around 12 miles when the engine entirely failed, causing us to come to a stop on the shoulder next to an overpass, while I watched through the mirrors, afraid that those chrome stacks would materialize in the distance. Diane was already on the phone with the state police, providing them with Nighthawk's location and description. Within 15 minutes, the police arrived. Our call was apparently not the first one they had received. Officer Walsh, a trooper, informed us that despite following similar complaints for weeks, they were never able to identify the offender. To make sure the truck stopped right away, he radioed backup. The next 4 hours were spent making statements, reviewing pictures, and recounting every detail we could recall about Nighthawk's rig, while another officer took us to the closest police station. That awful leaking sound from his face. When Walsh returned around to in the morning with an update, Diane started crying. The back doors of Nighthawk's trailer were ajar when they discovered it parked at the stop. They found a concealed room, behind a fake wall within the trailer, with scratch-marked walls and handcuffs fastened to the floor. Jeremy, the college student who had vanished 2 days prior, was the source of the blood we had observed. Despite being extremely dehydrated and exhibiting symptoms of frequent drugging, he was still alive, but hardly awake. The 2 other missing males from our route and 3 more they hadn't even connected yet were among the 6 other victims whose personal belongings they discovered concealed in different compartments. Nighthawk himself, whose true name was Walter Simmons, had disappeared on foot into the darkness of the plains. his rig a shell left behind. For 3 days, the manhunt continued. Dogs were running over the fields. Helicopters were flying overhead, but he appeared to have simply vanished. About a mile from the truck stop, they discovered his footsteps leading to a drainage culvert. Then nothing. There was a suspicion that he had another car hidden away. Perhaps this escape strategy had been planned all along. That was the last time we took that way, not able to accomplish it. 4 months following, we both became anxious whenever we saw a black truck, and Diane would leave the room whenever she heard a CB radio sparking to life. We took a significant wage reduction and moved to shorter local runs throughout Colorado, but we largely maintained our sanity. We received a few more calls from the FBI over the course of the following year, asking us whether we remembered any additional details while displaying pictures of possible encounters. After making it through his 3 days in the trailer, Jeremy testified. Simmons would whisper to him about the collection he was assembling, the narcotics, and the voices. He could hear through the walls. Only the wallets and keys of 2 of the other victims, who were never located, were hidden in a box under the floorboards of the trailer. The inquiry found that they feared Simmons had other trailers and hiding places they would never find, and that he had been driving trucks for 23 years, traveling the nation under many aliases. His seeming normalcy during our radio conversations, just another driver griping about the weather and traffic, swapping anecdotes and laughs over the airways, is what most disturbs me. After living under a false identity and driving a red Kenworth, they eventually apprehended him at a truck stop in Montana 14 months later. A novice motorist identified Simmons was sleeping in his taxi when he called it in and recognized him from the wanted posters. He had a 19-year-old hitchhiker who had been missing for 5 days in a secret compartment when they nabbed him. Despite being traumatized, the child lived. When we found Jeremy that night, Simmons never gave an explanation for why he let him to live, never gave many explanations. He actually accepted a plea bargain to avoid being executed, received several life terms without the possibility of release, and is currently incarcerated in a federal prison in Illinois. He looked like a weary old guy in that orange jumpsuit, all washed up and silent, and we had to testify during the sentencing. However, as he turned to face us from the defendant's table, his lips began to move once more in that same silent manner, as if he was still rehearsing something he would never be able to pronounce. 2 weeks following the trial, Diane and I sold our rig and utilized the proceeds to start a small hardware business in Wyoming. We haven't turned back. There are some roads that you should only drive on once. After 3 years of operating an 18-wheeler, I believed I had seen everything there was to see. In June of 2014, I was transporting frozen seafood from Portland to Phoenix. It was just another ordinary run that brought in $1,200, despite having more than 800,000 meters on her. My Peterbilt purred like a kitten when I required it. I had already driven for 7 hours that Thursday afternoon, and I had to get off the road quickly due to federal regulations. About 40 miles ahead, in the town of Millbrook, which is located directly off Route 93 in Nevada, the GPS indicated a truck stop. After sweating through another desert crossing, I required a nice shower facility and reasonable diesel costs, according to online recommendations. I had never heard of the location before. I got a strange feeling as soon as I arrived into Millbrook Truck Plaza around 4:30 in the afternoon. The main building appeared to have not been rebuilt since the 7 South, and there were only 3 other rigs parked in a lot that could easily accommodate 50. Half of the neon letters in the sign were burned out, and the walls were peeling off, faded yellow paint, but what mattered was that the diesel pumps were operating. After navigating my truck to pump number 7, I turned off the engine and got out of the cab. I felt the heat instantly. It must have been close to 105. I made the decision to go inside for some water and possibly get a sandwich for supper while the tank was filling up. The air conditioning blast seemed like a wheeze as the automated doors opened, heaven on my arms that are burnt. The interior was even more gloomy than the exterior. Fluorescent lights flickered, giving everything a sickly greenish appearance. Additionally, there was the odor of pine cleaner that hadn't done its job well, combined with old grease. The typical items were in the convenience store area: energy drinks, chips, beef jerky, and those tiny air fresheners in the shape of trees. This man, who must have been in his early 40s, stood behind the counter. He was slender as a rail and had arms that seemed out of proportion to his body. On top of that, he had thinning bleached blonde hair, combed over in a manner that exacerbated it. He had on a soiled white tank top rather than any sort of uniform, and his name tag read Vernon. His eyes met mine and remained fixed on me as soon as I entered. Guys, not in the typical manner, occasionally gaze. He seemed to be trying to commit every information about me to memory, but this was different, more calculated. I took a pre-wrapped turkey sandwich that appeared to be at least passably edible, along with a bottle of water from the cooler. I then walked over to the counter. Vernon's teeth were unexpectedly straight and white when he smiled at me, which somehow made everything else about him appear even more off. "Afternoon, miss," she replied, spoke in a higher-pitched, nearly singing voice than I had anticipated. I offered him my usual evasive response. "Don't see many lady drivers come through here." "Where you headed, if you don't mind me asking?" "South." Despite having a delivery to make, he persisted. "Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Phoenix. Family is all over me. May be aware of some suitable locations for you to pause." He was tapping the counter with his fingers. He continued to lean forward as though he was attempting to get closer to me, and his long, pallid fingers had their nails bitten to nothing. I firmly said, "Just passing through," and took out my cash to make the payment. Instead of immediately inserting my $20 into the register, he held it up to the light as if to make sure it wasn't a fake. He continued to chat the entire time. "Are you going to park here this evening? We have a lot of room, and it's really quiet out here. Nobody annoys anyone. Then my stomach tightened at something he did. He kept his gaze fixed on me as he licked his thumb, and then counted me my change. He continued by putting the money in my palm, one by one, and rubbing his fingertips over my flesh for longer than was required. "I get off at midnight," he said. "I occasionally stroll about the lot to check on everyone's safety, particularly the women who are traveling alone. You can't be too cautious now, can you?" I wanted to take a shower after hearing him say ladies. I gathered my belongings and made my way out the door, but I could sense him observing me the entire while. It was almost 6 p.m. when I finally located a parking space and completed filling up. I picked a spot at the far end of the lot that was still beneath a functional light pole, but distant from the building. Through the store windows, I could see Vernon from my taxi, and he would glance out into the parking lot every few minutes. I attempted to convince myself that my paranoia was unfounded. Perhaps he was simply lonely. He might not have been dangerous, but I had learned to trust my gut about people from my 20 years of bartending before I became a truck driver. After locking my doors and drawing my curtains, I tucked in with a book and a meal for the night. I felt a little better about 9 o'clock when I heard another vehicle pull in. I was no longer alone out here, at least. Around 10:30, I fell asleep with my tire iron close at hand and my phone charging next to me. At precisely 12:17 a.m., someone knocked on my window. I can tell because when my eyes opened, the first thing I noticed was the green glow of my dashboard clock. There were 3 slow, methodical knocks, followed by a break and 3 more. I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. I noticed a man standing directly next to my driver's side door through a hole in the curtain. There were strange shadows from the parking lot light, but I could see plenty. Vernon was there, and he had taken off his shirt. He had no hair on his pale chest, which seemed to sparkle in the artificial light. Additionally, I noticed that he had something in his right hand. As he moved his weight from foot to foot, the curled end of the crowbar caught the light. He knocked again, more forcefully. Then, with a muffled voice that still had that sing-along quality, he spoke. "Greetings, lady driver. I noticed that your lights were off. You're lonely out here. You might want some company, I thought." I remained motionless, scarcely breathing, hoping he would assume was asleep and go away. Vernon, however, was not about to give up so simply. With a terrible scraping sound against the metal, he began to move around my truck and pull the crowbar along the side. He said, "I know you're awake in there," his voice growing louder. "Your curtain moved." He made a full round around my rig. "Don't be rude now. I just want to talk." He slammed his face against the window as soon as he returned to the driver's side. I could see those two white teeth in the darkness, and I could see his breath fogging up the glass. "Come on, my love, let yourself be open. We had some beers that I brought. Over there, they're in my pickup." Using the crowbar, he gestured toward a battered Ford Ranger parked roughly 50 feet away, which was undoubtedly not there when I had gone to bed. "We could enjoy ourselves quite a bit. All evening, you have been on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about you." In the dark, my hand located my phone, but I was unable to unlock it because my fingers were shaking so much that I kept missing the numbers. Vernon's unexpected aggression must have been triggered by the light from the screen. "Who are you phoning?" "The police. I wish you luck in your endeavor, my love. The closest station is 45 minutes distant. A cousin of mine works as a dispatcher." In any case, he began to attempt the door handle, pulling so forcefully that the entire cab rocked. He then proceeded to the passenger side and carried out the same action. When that failed, he fell silent for a while, and for some reason, the silence was worse than all of his talking. At last, I was able to call 911, but as he had mentioned, the call was unsuccessful. No signal. My phone was out in the middle of nowhere. Essentially a high-end flashlight. Outside, I could hear his bare feet smacking the tarmac as he moved about. Then I heard a hiss of air coming from one of my tires, which made my entire body go rigid. "Oops," Vernon yelled, his voice brimming with pretended worrying. "It appears that you have a flat. It's going to be really difficult to drive out of here now, won't it?" I heard him move to another tire, and I knew I had to do something. "To flats, actually. Maybe 3 by the time I'm done." I silently unlocked the passenger door and retrieved the tire iron and my phone, which I could see with its flashlight. I had a straightforward plan. Run to the other truck I heard about earlier, get out on the other side from where he was, and knock on their door until they assist me. However, my heart fell when I opened the door and peered outside. There was no sign of the other truck, Vernon, and I were the only people in the lot. He heard me draw the door close as softly as possible. "She's there." I heard him running to the passenger side when he finished singing. All set to play at last. Despite my patience, I'm growing weary of this game. That's when something changed within me. I refused to be killed in this parking lot by some eerie gas station employee. I had made it through my ex-husband's intoxicated outbursts. I had made it through 3 years of driving over mountain passes and ice storms, and I was more than capable of making it through Vernon. With my hand on the ignition, I stepped onto the driver's seat and tightened my hold on the tire iron. I could still move the truck, possibly even hit his Ford, and create enough noise to draw attention from the highway even with flat tires. However, Vernon did something unexpected when I turned the key. He ascended to my hood. He was squatting there like a pallid gargoyle, the crowbar up above his head, and I could see him clearly through the glass. He said, "You're going to make me break this nice windshield." As he spat, he slammed the crowbar down hard, and the glass spider-webbed, but did not break. "That's going to cost you extra, sweetheart. The second blow would be delivered." I was aware. However, I had already started the engine and took the only action that sprang to mind. I floored it and slammed it into reverse. With a sound like a bag of meat hitting concrete, Vernon flew off the hood and landed hard on the asphalt. I didn't pause to check on him. The truck lurched forward on its damaged tires as I placed it into drive, making this terrible grinding noise as the rim struck the tarmac, sparks streaming from my wheels. I reached the highway entrance and continued on. 2 miles further down the road, I noticed the lights of a large chain truck stop with a large crowd. I probably completely destroyed my rims as I pulled in, but it didn't matter to me. The real police were contacted by the security officer there, and they discovered Vernon back at his station, accusing me of attacking him and driving away without paying for petrol. The security footage, however, painted a different picture. As it happens, Vernon had previously done this. Over the previous 2 years, 3 other female truckers had also had similar experiences, but they had all been able to leave before things got out of hand. The 4th and last was me. When they caught him that evening, they discovered zip ties and rope in his Ford, as well as a number of women's CDL licenses that he had reportedly stolen from earlier victims. 2 rims and 4 tires needed to be replaced. Cost me around $3,000, but I continue to drive. Nowadays, I always carry more than just a tire iron, and I just never stop at little truck stops. That October evening in 2022, the Alabama backcountry felt like milk soup as the 4-gate up Highway 278. By then, I had spent around 15 years moving furniture from Mississippi to Atlanta, knew all of the speed bumps and potholes between the Georgia border and Birmingham. I had all the typical trucker decorations in my Peterbilt's cap, my mother's ancient rosary swinging from the rearview mirror, an Elvis bobblehead my youngest gave me, and affixed to the visor were pictures of my wife Nancy and our boys. I was 3 hours behind schedule on Tuesday due to a blown tire near Tupelo, and the dashboard clock read to 47 a.m. when I reached that vacant 278 in vivid green figures. In less than an hour, the temperature had plummeted from 70 to 40, transforming the humid air into a wall of white mist that was barely perceptible through my highlights. She showed up just inside the tree line, about 50 feet ahead on the passenger side, at the edge of where my lights reached. Not possible being older than 17, wearing what may have been a nightgown, but now hung in tatters from her slender figure, exposing one shoulder entirely. Both of her arms were swinging over her head in that frightened way that smacks you in the gut, and her dark hair was matted with dirt and leaves, hanging below her waist in thick clumps. I couldn't hear anything over the diesel engine, but her mouth was open like she was screaming. Her jerking, desperate movements, like someone drowning in air, caused me to apply the brakes so forcefully that I threw my coffee thermos on the windshield. My initial reaction was to reach for the .38. I kept it beneath my seat. You learn to be cautious of roadside situations from 15 years of night driving. However, this girl's bare feet were bleeding, leaving dark tracks on the wet asphalt, and her tears were streaking clean lines across the dirt on her cheeks. While I staggered up to my truck and, with one hand close to my phone, slid down the passenger window approximately halfway. I yelled out, "You hurt, you need help." But she only continued pointing back toward the trees and waving while her mouth moved in unintelligible sounds. And then she did something that made my arms stand on end. Abruptly, she fell to her. She dropped to her knees on the side of the road and began digging with her fingernails, much like a dog attempting to remove berries. The wind didn't fit the patterns of the fog swirling around her. In a matter of seconds, the temperature dropped by an additional 10, I promise. She must have noticed the movement because she got up and went directly at my truck, banging her palms against the passenger door as I reached for my phone to dial 911. When I looked closely, I could see that her lips were blue-purple, as if she had spent too much time in frigid water, and that her wrists had these odd scars on them, more like indentations precisely round and uniformly spaced, than cuts. She repeatedly mouthed the same thing until I was able to read her lips. "There are others." She then turned and ran back into the trees, vanishing into the shadows between two enormous oaks that appeared to have stood there since before the Civil War. After idling the engine for perhaps 30 seconds, trying to take in what I had just witnessed, I picked up my phone and called the state police. After taking my location, the dispatcher, a woman with a strong Montgomery accent, stated that units were 20 minutes away. When you're busy, 20 minutes seem like hours. Pondering whether the girl needs assistance right now while sitting by herself on a pitch-black highway, I was unable to wait. After securing my mag light and the crowbar I keep beneath the seat, I parked my truck on the shoulder and made my way to the 2 oak trees where she had disappeared. It smelled like wet pennies mixed with antifreeze, and the ground was practically squishy under my boots, softer than it should have been for October. 30 feet or so into the forest, my something that shouldn't have been there was captured by the flashlight. Between a few trees was a blue tarp, and beneath it is a 4-foot wide pit in the earth that resembles an ancient well and has wooden planks around the perimeter. However, this wasn't good. A rebar and rope ladder had been erected by someone, and it led down into utter darkness. I kept thinking about her, saying, "Others," even though it would have been wiser to wait for the police. I almost dropped my flashlight after aiming it down the hole and seeing what was underneath. The hole, which was around 8 feet deep, led to what appeared to be a room scooped out of the ground and held up by plywood sheets, and to by 4 seconds. The corner of a mattress, some shelves constructed out of boards and cinder blocks, and what appeared to be dozens of mason jars filled with a dark substance were all visible to me. However, the worst aspect was the wall. The support beams had been pounded with eye bolts, and the length of chain that ended in what were undoubtedly shekels hung from each one. There was not a trace of rust on them, and the metal was gleaming and new. I heard heavy boots rushing quickly through the underbrush and branches shattering behind me as I was retreating away from the hole. I crashed as I ran harder than I have since high school football, through thorns and branches. Behind me, that crowbar was still gripped in my right hand. I didn't slow down until I exploded out of the tree iron and saw my truck's running lights, but the footsteps stopped suddenly. 12 minutes later, the state police arrived. A parade of vehicles, including the FBI, search and rescue, and even a mobile forensics van, followed by 2 cruisers. They discovered the bunker precisely where I had predicted, as well as proof that at least 6 individuals had recently been housed inside. I don't want to think about the blood and other fluids that discolored the bedding. It appeared as though someone was gathering the human teeth in those mason jars, which were arranged according to type, with murs in some and incisors in others. They brought in excavators and cadaver dogs, worked there for 3 days in a row. They discovered further rooms connected by tiny tunnels that stretched out beneath the forest floor like cancer, but they never found any bodies. For roughly a week, the story was in the news. They never located the girl I saw or the person who had been pursuing me through those woods, despite the trucker finding a potential human trafficking site and all that. When I called it in, the FBI agent in charge, Fitzgerald, who had lifeless fish eyes, told me I had likely saved lives. Down there, they discovered fresh food and unspoiled milk. Prescription bottles that had only been dated a few days earlier. They had quickly left the underground labyrinth where someone had been residing and holding people in those chains. What was not included in the what followed was news, which is why I'm writing this now in an attempt to make sense of it all. I still check my mirrors more than I should because 3 weeks after that night on Highway 278th, things became personal. I was filling up at a love station close to Meridian when I received the first SMS. I didn't recognize the number that buzzed on my phone, 10 zeros, no area code. I showed it to the station manager, thinking it might be a scam, but he shrugged and said, "Truckers get weird messages all the time." The message said, Douglas Brennan, Peterbilt 579, license, Alabama, JKR 88-3. You should have kept driving. My full name, my exact truck model, and my license plate number that I just renewed 2 months prior. I was resting in my taxi at a rest stop that same evening when I received the second text. It was not a lost girl. She served as bait. Don't converse with the badges. There was a picture attached this time. The week prior, I was photographed from behind as I entered the FBI field office in Birmingham. I could see the coffee stain on my flannel shirt, since whoever removed it had been close enough. For additional drivers from my firm received similar SMS by the end of that week. In the previous month, they had all drove that 278-mile stretch. Their true names, truck information, and even home addresses were included in every correspondence. Kevin Garrett, one of the drivers, received a video of his daughter leaving of her Huntsville elementary school. We all reported it to the FBI, but Fitzgerald simply stated that they were looking into it and advised us to change our routes and be vigilant. Another man, Paul, received a close-up picture of his wife's car parked at her place of employment with the caption, "Beautiful family. Shame, yes, they traveled alone." It was simple for him to say. He wasn't the one hauling loads through the back roads of Alabama at night, jumping whenever his phone rang, and wondering if the person who had been holding people in chains underground was now observing him when he spoke to his family from vacant parking lots, ate at truck stops, and slept at rest areas. The most recent text I received was not like the others. I was at home with Nancy and the boys on a Wednesday morning, trying to seem like nothing was wrong. Just coordinates 33. The grain and 85 is 5,186. 2 words and 7,801 degrees Lou. She's waiting. When I entered those numbers into my GPS, it directed me to a location fully 2 miles away from the female I had spotted in the same forest. There was a part of me that wanted to change careers, erase the message, and never drive a truck again. However, I couldn't stop thinking about that girl's bloodied feet, her blue lips, and how desperate she had been when mouthing people. I drove out to those coordinates that afternoon with my 38 loaded and the FBI field office on speed dial, even though I had told Nancy was going to the hardware store. It was an old logging road that was just wide enough for a pickup truck and was covered in kudzu. There was a cleared space at the end of the road with one white vehicle that was unmarked, its windows painted black, and its engine running, but no one within. A manila envelope bearing my name in meticulous block letters was resting on the driver's seat. There were dozens of photos inside. I saw the same girl that night, although she was dressed differently and was about 5 years older. In some, she appeared normal, smiling, and healthy. And she was usually in wooded locations with different people, always wearing the same expression of trained sorrow. In the final picture, she was sitting in what appeared to be a diner booth, dressed normally, sipping a milkshake, and laughing at something that wasn't on camera. Ashley performs 3 times a week. Good drivers stop. Curious drivers dig deeper. Someone had written on the back, "I left everything in its original location," drove straight to the FBI headquarters, and gave it all to Fitzgerald. 2 days later, he called to report that the van was gone. The logging road had no tire marks, and the pictures I had provided him where I had been driving trucks for about 6 years at that point, mostly regional runs that kept me within a day's drive of home. I was 38, divorced, and pretty much married to the job by then. That night, I pulled into a truck stop just off Interstate 65 somewhere between Michigan and Tennessee. That was 8 months ago, and I haven't driven Highway 278 since. I was transporting a load of frozen goods from Michigan down to Tennessee in late July 2011. I remember looking at my watch. I parked, since it was just after 11 p.m. and the lot was about 3/4 full. It was one of those huge plazas with maybe 200 parking spaces, a diner that never closed, and shower facilities that truckers like me live for after 14 hours on the road. After getting my shower bag and clean clothes from the sleeper cab, I crossed the lot to the shower building, which was about 150 feet away from where I'd squeezed my Peterbilt between two other rigs. The walk there was uneventful, with only the typical hum of idling engines and the occasional hiss of air brakes. The shower facility was fairly standard, with a concrete block building painted beige and fluorescent lights that I paid my $12 to a child who couldn't have been older than 19. Got my receipt with the door code and went to stall number 7. The shower itself was heaven after sweating through Indiana's humidity all day. I must have stood under that hot water for 20 minutes, just letting it work out the knots in my shoulders and wash away the road grime. The parking lot had changed when I finally stepped out around 11:45. I could hear a dog barking somewhere in the distance, probably from one of the cabs, and the sound of someone's radio playing old country music. Most of the overhead lights were still on, but they cast these long shadows between the trucks that had not been as noticeable before. As I passed the fuel islands, I saw a freight liner with its high beams pointed directly across the lot, and initially assumed the driver had I kept walking, my wet hair beginning to feel cold in the night air, and tried to ignore the lights, flicking off for a moment, then back on, off again, on again. It was a deliberate pattern, almost like Morse code, but there was no rhythm to it. I had forgotten to turn them off, which is a common occurrence when guys are tired. The freight liner was actually turning, just a little, repositioning itself, as I moved through the lot, and I could hear the low rumble of an engine adjusting every few steps, and the light beam would shift to keep me in its glare. I was about halfway to my truck when I realized those high beams were following me, and I had to weave between other rigs to get there, and my truck was still 4 rows away. The intensity of those lights made it impossible to see who was behind the wheel, just a bright white void where the windshield should be. I picked up my pace, not quite running, but definitely faster than my usual stride. I could hear that engine rev up when I passed behind another trailer, temporarily blocking the light as if the driver was agitated and had lost sight of me. At one point, the Freightliner's engine went silent, and I thought perhaps the driver had abandoned whatever strange game he was playing. But then I heard a door slam, that characteristic metallic thud of a cab door closing hard, and I looked back to see a figure climbing down from the Freightliner. The shower bag continued to bump against my leg, and I could feel water from my hair dripping down my back, soaking through my clean shirt. When he reached back into his cab and pulled out something long and metal, it took me a moment to realize it was a tire iron. He was tall, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", wearing what appeared to be coveralls and a baseball cap pulled low. His movements weren't the usual weary shuffle of a driver who'd been on the road too long. Instead, he was moving with purpose, cutting diagonally across the lot, obviously trying to block my path. When I ducked between 2 refrigerated trailers, their cooling units humming loudly enough to cover my footsteps, I saw his boots, worn red wings with duct tape around one toe, stopping exactly where I'd been walking moments earlier. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, just waiting, listening. My truck was still 2 rows away, and this guy was closing the distance faster than I felt comfortable with. I doubled back, staying low, using the shadows and the noise from the reefer units as cover, and I made it to the next row of trucks, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the lot could hear it. Then those boots started moving again, slower this time, heading toward the front of the trailers, where he probably thought I'd come out. Through the tangle of trailers and mud flaps, I could see my Peterbilt, dark blue with a custom chrome grille that seemed suddenly way too distinctive. I could hear him moving somewhere behind me, the occasional scrape of metal against metal as that tire iron hit a trailer or bumper. But the thing that made every muscle in my body tense up was that he was whistling not a tune exactly, just this low, breathy whistle, as if he were trying to get to it, without having to cross 30 feet of open space under those bright pole lights. I pressed myself against the rear doors of a swift trailer, trying to think, my keys in my pocket, but getting into the cab, starting the engine, and pulling out would take time I wasn't sure I had. And then I heard another driver, a heavy-set guy wearing a Broncos jersey, walking toward the restrooms. The sound of someone calling a dog reverberated off the trailers, making it difficult to pinpoint his exact location. I nearly called out to him, maybe 50 feet away, but as soon as I opened my mouth, the whistling stopped, and there was only the sound of idling engines. I glanced around the corner of the trailer and saw my stalker standing motionless between two trucks, with that tire iron loose at his side, watching the other driver go by. His face was still hidden under that cap, but I could see that he had a scraggly beard with something white in it, possibly food or dried toothpaste. He vanished into the restroom building. The whistling continued, closer this time, and I could actually see him now through the landing gear of the trailer I was hiding behind, methodically checking between each truck, swinging that tire iron in little circles like he had all the time in the world. My legs were cramping from crouching, and he was only 3 trucks away from me, so I knew I had to get moving. I took a big breath, grabbed my shower bag, and started running, and as soon as I did, I heard him react. I didn't turn around, instead focusing on the handle of my truck, my fingers fumbling with the keys, slipping once on the lock before I got it open, and I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door and hitting the locks in one motion. I heard boots pounding on asphalt, and that tire iron clanging against something metal. About 10 feet away, he stopped and stood there in the pole lamp's light, and for the first time, I could see his face clearly. He had weathered skin, possibly in his mid-50s, and pale grey eyes that never blinked. He tilted his head as if he was thinking about something, then lifted that tire iron and pointed it at me through the window. He wasn't particularly menacing, but more like he was. I started the engine, my entire body shaking now that I was somewhat safe, and he just stood there watching as I put the truck in gear, marking me, filing me away for later. I had to drive past him to reach the exit, and he actually moved aside to let me pass, making this small mock bow as I did so. When I checked my truck during my pre-trip inspection, the following morning at a different stop, I discovered something that still makes me sick to think about. New scratches on my trailer doors that spell out my license plate number, as if he had carved it there before. I watched him walk calmly back toward his freight liner, tossing the tire iron up and catching it like a baton. I didn't stop driving for another 2 hours, finally pulling into a well-lit pilot station near the Kentucky border. The cop who took my report stated that they had received similar complaints from other female drivers over the past few months, always at different stops along that stretch of I-65. The same pattern, the high beams, the stalking, the tire iron. I'd even returned from my shower when I reported the incident to the state police and the truck stop management, giving them every detail I could recall. They never caught the guy, but one Indiana driver reported that after an incident similar to mine, she had discovered her air brake lines partially cut, and another said that her trailer seal was broken and her cargo disturbed. Despite the fact that nothing was stolen, the Freightliner's license plates was able to see belonged to a company that had shut down 3 years prior. The police said he probably scouts these lots for women driving alone, maybe listening to CB chatter, or watching for single drivers at the fuel islands. They advised me to start carrying protection and to always park near other trucks I knew. I still drive that route occasionally. It's good. The truck stop security cameras conveniently had a blind spot right where he'd parked. Money and I can't afford to be picky about loads, but I never stop at that plaza anymore, and I never take a nighttime shower at any truck stop. Thanks to experiences like this, I've met other female drivers who have also changed their routines, some of whom have quit completely. At stops, we exchange information, alerting one another to suspicious cars or drivers who make us feel uneasy. We both know what those most likely are. Last month, Bethany, a driver, told me that she had seen a freight liner with its high beams on at a rest area near Indianapolis, just sitting there watching. She said that upon closer inspection, she could see scratches on the driver's door, dozens of numbers and letters carved into the paint like some sort of collection. I know exactly what he's looking for with those pale grey eyes and that tire iron, and every female trucker on I-65 drives a little faster through that stretch of road. Music 23 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. He's still out there, probably with a new truck by now, perhaps a different strategy. Nothing, and I mean nothing at all, could have prepared me for what happened on that Monday morning in early May 2017 when I was transporting a load of dairy equipment from Madison down to Milwaukee, a route I had probably traveled 100 times. I believed I had seen everything the road could throw at me, including wrong turns in the middle of nowhere, black ice that turned highways into skating rinks, and even a tornado that landed maybe half a mile from where I had pulled over. I'd been awake since 4 o'clock, and I recalled thinking that the weather was ideal, not too hot, not too cold, and with visibility improving by the minute as the sun had just begun to burn through the morning fog. The overpass on County Road K had always been part of my usual route. It was one of those concrete structures you pass under without giving it a second thought, built in the 1970s, according to the date stamp I'd noticed once when traffic had me crawling underneath it. That morning, I was doing about 55, keeping it steady. When I heard this, I grabbed coffee and eggs at this little diner off Highway 151, where the waitress, Dolores, always remembered how I liked my toast barely golden, just warm enough to melt butter. The whole cab began vibrating in a strange rhythmic pattern that didn't match the engine or the road surface. I could see the overpass maybe 200 feet behind me through my mirrors, and at first everything appeared normal, but then I noticed it. The sound was like someone dragging a huge chain across concrete, but it was deeper and more guttural. My first instinct was to press the gas and get as far away from whatever was going on back there as possible. But this is where things went sideways. A crack was spreading across the support pillar like lightning in slow motion, and chunks of concrete the size of refrigerators were beginning to separate from the main structure. You know how it feels to be on a boat when a large wave hits? Well, imagine that feeling multiplied by 1,000 when you're in a 40-ton car traveling at 55 miles per hour. The road beneath me was literally no longer just a road. It was moving, tilting at this incomprehensible angle. I could hear the trailer behind me moaning, metal twisting in ways it was never intended to twist, and I could see the overpass simply fold in on itself through my passenger side mirrors. The asphalt cracked and split open like the earth had decided to yawn right there beneath my wheels. I will never forget the sound of all that weight hitting the ground like thunder that wouldn't stop rolling. My rig began jackkniffing, the trailer swinging out to the left while the cab kept trying to go straight. The steering wheel was useless at that point. It might as well have been trying to steer a shopping cart down a waterfall. Someone had scored it down the middle and bent it backwards. Cars that had been crossing above were sliding off the edges. I could see the ground rising quickly through all those cracks, and everything in the cab went airborne, including my coffee mug, logbook, and the small wooden cross my daughter had given me for good luck. It was all floating for this surreal moment before gravity remembered its job. The windshield spider-webbed but didn't break. However, the ground wasn't where it should have been, and we were falling, me and the entire rig, through what had once been a solid highway. My GPS's altimeter was going nuts, with numbers descending like a countdown, and I recall thinking, this is it. It ends like this. It happened on a Monday morning, while Dolores was likely still pouring coffee for the breakfast crowd, not in some dramatic movie scene. The impact happened gradually, starting with the front wheels colliding with a solid object that turned out to be a support beam that had fallen horizontally across the gap. Glass flew everywhere, and I bit my tongue almost clean through without realizing it. The cab pitched forward so violently that my seat belt felt like it was trying to cut me in half. Then the trailer caught up, slamming into the back of the cab with enough force to blow out the rear window. The engine was screaming, still trying to run, even though we were suspended at this crazy angle, nose down, maybe 30 the passenger. Door was my only option, and it was stuck against a huge piece of concrete that wouldn't budge no matter how hard I kicked. I could smell diesel fuel leaking, hear it splashing somewhere below me, and all I could think about was those safety videos they make you watch about fuel fires and how you only have about 90 seconds to get out before everything goes up. Option. But I had to climb across the cab while hanging in my seatbelt like a deranged jungle gym, and every time I moved, the entire rig shifted and groaned, with pieces of the collapsed overpass still falling around us and bouncing off the trailer. With these hollow metallic gongs, I opened the passenger door, and it swung out and down, hanging into empty space, and below me, I could see twisted rebar sticking up like massive metal thorns, concrete chunks the size of compact cars, and other cars that hadn't been as fortunate as me were all present in the chaos when I heard a woman's voice calling for assistance from one of those cars. Her calls weren't panicked. Rather, they were measured and purposeful, as if she was trying to getting out meant letting go of everything I knew about safety and just trusting physics I didn't understand. I unclipped my seatbelt while bracing against the steering wheel and slid straight toward the passenger door. My work boots found purchase on the center console, then the door frame, and I essentially had to spider crawl out while the entire cab was being evacuated. It made the whole thing real in a way that my own situation hadn't quite registered yet. I could feel the truck shifting with each pound of pressure I applied to various spots, and the metal was hot from friction, burning through my gloves, making it sway like a drunk, trying to stay motionless. When I finally got outside, standing on what was technically the passenger door and gripping the mirror mount, I realized the full extent of the catastrophe. The overpass hadn't just collapsed, it had taken out a section of the highway, perhaps 300 feet long. The woman's voice came again, clearer now that I was outside, and she was in a silver minivan about 40 feet below me. My rig was caught on debris about halfway down, like a toy truck dropped in a construction site. Above me, people were gathered at the edges of the intact road, some filming with their phones, others shouting down, asking if I was okay. I could see her hand waving through a gap in the wreckage, and she was saying she couldn't feel her legs, calmly, as if she were reporting the weather. I knew I had to get down there, but the path was nothing but twisted metal, broken concrete, an exposed rebar that looked like it could cut through you like a hot knife through butter. I started descending anyhow, using the trailer's undercarriage as a ladder, then jumping to a relatively stable piece of road that had landed at an angle. My ankle rolled when I landed. I heard it pop. But that's the funny thing about adrenaline. I didn't feel anything until much later. I could hear sirens nearby, but they were so far away. This woman kept talking, telling me that her name was Grace, that she was a teacher, that she had 32 students waiting for her, and that she asked me to stay with her until help arrived. It was the strange things you see at 3 in the morning on deserted highways. For the next 40 minutes, I held Grace's hand through a gap that was just wide enough for our fingers to touch. She told me about her classroom, how she decorated it with paper butterflies made by the kids, and how one student, Anthony, always brought her apple slices because he had decided teachers needed vitamins. Her voice would occasionally fade, and I would squeeze her fingers and tell her about my roots. Other survivors were emerging from the wreckage, including a family of 4 from a crushed SUV, a man in a tuxedo walking a peacock on a leash, and a broken piano sitting perfectly centered in the middle of the road, as if someone had placed it there on purpose to keep her talking and conscious. The diesel smell was growing stronger, and I could see fluid pooling under several vehicles. We formed this strange little community in the ruins, helping each other, sharing water from a cooler someone had pulled from their destroyed car, and an old man who kept asking what year it was, with blood streaming down his face from a gash that looked like someone had unzipped his scalp. About an hour after the collapse, first responders finally rappelled down, and it was like watching as they used the jaws of life to extract Grace, and I will never forget the sound those instruments made, like enormous metal teeth gnawing into a tin can. It was a choreographed dance, with every action planned, precise, and free of wasted energy. They hauled my rig out 3 days later, taking to enormous cranes working in tandem. The paramedic who checked me out said my ankle was broken in 2 places, and after walking on it for almost an hour, he asked if I was superhuman. I told him that I was just a truck driver who needed to help someone, and I was conscious the entire time, even managing to squeeze my hand one last time before they lifted her into the basket. The insurance assessor, who arrived to inspect it, simply stood there shaking his head and repeated, like a chant, "Nobody should have survived this." The cab was twisted beyond recognition, and the trailer shattered open like a cracked egg. 2 weeks later, the investigation got underway. State and federal inspectors officials, men in suits who were recording every moment of the collapse with cameras and clipboards. They conducted 4 different interviews with me, asking the same questions in different ways, as if they were attempting to expose a lie. Was there anything odd about the overpass that I had previously noticed? On past journeys, had I sensed any vibrations? Did I weigh more than I was allowed to? No, and definitely no were the responses. I had all the documentation to prove that my load was underweight that day. After the 3rd interview, I was brought aside by an inspector, Jimenez, a lady with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. She advised me to keep an eye on the news in the upcoming weeks, but she was unable to provide many legal justifications. It has been said that sometimes the true horror lies not in what occurs, but rather in the reasons it was permitted. Her meaning was unclear to me, until the subcontractor in charge of maintaining that section of infrastructure, Harbour Construction, was the subject of the news. It was discovered that Harbour Construction had been submitting inspection reports for overpasses and bridges that they had never really examined. 3 years' worth of signed documents unmarked, detailing in-depth analyses of buildings they had never even seen too. The owner, Christopher Lawson, had been keeping the inspection money for himself while hiring a young person just out of community college to make up the reports using weather data and Google Earth photos to make them appear real. The collapsed overpass, 6 weeks prior to its collapse, it had passed a thorough structural assessment, according to their records. In actuality, no one had examined it in person for more than 4 years. Water damage and freeze-thaw cycles had been gradually weakening the failed support pillar. The concrete has cracks that are growing like cancer. It would have been visible to anyone who had taken the time to look. The result was paralysis from the waist down for Grace. I never even saw the cars in which 3 people perished, all because someone believed their profit margin was more important than carrying out their paid duties. Lawson received an 8-year sentence. There are settlements for the family. I still occasionally wake up from dreams after getting a new RIG, playing repeatedly the sound of concrete breaking apart. But I'm back behind the wheel, different bridges, same pathways. You may be sure that I now view every overpass in a different way. When this occurred, I had only been travelling for about 9 months. Although I'm still inexperienced enough to be wary of every new stop, I'm confident enough in my driving skills to think I could manage myself, carrying refrigerated items to a chain store at a place I had never heard of. I had accepted a late load travelling east through Missouri. Up until about 2:30 in the morning, the drive went smoothly. When I arrived at an off-highway rest area, it was strangely empty for that hour. I recall there was only a dimly lighted parking lot, and the distant murmur of insects in the trees bordering the lot. No movement, no idle vehicles. I was accustomed to sleeping in the taxi because it wasn't my first time doing so. I parked close to the lights, locked the doors, kept the keys handy, crawled into the sleeper, and covered my head with a sweater to block out the light from the overhead lamps. I believe I had just begun to drift when there was a knock. A few steady raps on the driver's side door. Nothing urgent or sharp. I broke through the curtain and noticed a man, possibly in his mid-40s, standing there with cargo pants and a navy work shirt that were discolored around the knees. His erect stance suggested that he was attempting to avoid appearing impatient. I inquired whether everything was okay while slightly cracking the glass. He claimed to be another driver who needed assistance with a hefty box in his taxi after, harking to spots over, said that he was unable to move it by himself since he had injured his back unloading. I looked in the direction he indicated. Yes, a dark red, older vehicle with no obvious corporate identification, no lights on, and no operating engine was present. I told him that, particularly at this hour of the night, I didn't feel secure leaving my truck. He didn't dispute. He remained motionless for a moment longer, nodded tightly at me, and turned away. I didn't lock things again until he was out of sight. I just sat there listening for a long. I thought I may hear his doors thumping as his motor started up. However, nothing was present, not a move, simply the same strange silence, as if the entire space had become empty. I began to feel as though I was being observed after about 10 minutes of silence, not in a paranoid sense, but rather in a subtly creepy way that makes your spine tense. For no apparent reason, I saw something in my mirror at that moment. There was a shift in his truck. Now it was parked a few feet off my bumper, right behind mine. It hadn't moved, I heard. There was only silence, no headlights, no roar of the engine. Then he appeared out of nowhere. My only clear route out of the lot was blocked by the red truck, which was parked at an angle. Keeping low in the sleeper, I switched off my dome light and observed from the shadows behind the curtain. I didn't see him again for a minute or two. Like he was waiting or pondering, he got out of his cab and made a slow circuit around both trucks. He walked methodically, as he had done all night, without hurrying or being careless. I climbed into the driver's seat without turning on any lights because my truck was still running. I took advantage of the moment when the man briefly vanished behind my trailer. I put it in drive and pulled the wheel sharply to the left, aiming for the grassy strip between the vehicle area and the truck lot. The setup handled the rough, uneven terrain better than I had anticipated. I heard what might have been a trailer scrape. I didn't care about the concrete divider, though. All I needed was some distance. I blasted it as soon as I reached the pavements once more. I didn't even turn around until I got to the next on-ramp, where I parked into a well-lit, crowded gas station. I parked close to the front under floodlights and sat there with the doors shut and the motor humming. I was not crying or trembling. That was not the type of terror. It pressed down on everything more like a cold, rigid attentiveness. I kept thinking about how easily things may have turned out differently if I had gone outside or if I had gone back to sleep. I remained there until the sun began to rise. I called dispatch and made up a tale about a construction delay to conceal the detour because I wasn't supposed to deliver the load until late in the morning. I kept the true reason from them. I didn't want to come across as having panicked over nothing, and it felt too weird to describe. I still remember the rest stop for some reason. A few days later, an elderly driver I had previously met at another terminal brought up that section of the roadway. Claimed it made him feel uneasy. He explained that two men had vanished from the same rest site around a month prior. When I asked why, not a trace of them, trucks left behind, no video, simply disappeared. I wasn't prepared for how hard that affected me. I had kept what had occurred to me from him. I had kept it a secret. However, upon hearing it, everything fell into place. He wasn't merely seeking assistance with a package at the rest break. He had a strategy. He had already done it. Additionally, he had the patience to wait 4 hours on end, assuming that I would be sufficiently exhausted and trusted to exit my taxi. Perhaps he assumed I would eventually lose it. Or perhaps he was simply taking chances. I didn't like how close I was to becoming one of those drivers who went missing, in any case. When I came home, I combed through local news reports to check the news. A brief piece buried amid weather and traffic updates was all that was there. Both long-distance truckers were last observed at the same rest area. The doors of both trucks were open and the keys were still inside when they were discovered. No indications of conflict, no coerced admittance, only taxis that are empty. On his first solo run, one of them came from out of state. I remembered that detail. I considered his family, who most likely anticipated his return in a few days. How a man with a clean shirt and a soothing voice can be all that was needed. I stopped napping at rest breaks entirely after that. I only parked in truck plazas that had personnel, lights, and cameras. Even so, I didn't get out of the taxi until it was completely light outside. I purchased a steel baton that I placed jammed next to the seat and improved the locks on both doors. I always double-checked my mirrors and backed into a position with a clear exit path before parking. It wasn't paranoia, it was math. That man had this as likely been done more than twice, and I was the one who didn't fall for it. If there was ever a box at all, I'm still curious as to what was in the one he mentioned. A part of me believes it was merely a statement or a means of luring someone in close enough. However, there are times when I imagine him standing in the dark with a large object in his arms during those peaceful times on the road. Not that he needed assistance transporting a package, not freight. And I recall how simple it would have been for me to say yes.